My name's Clayton Bai. I'm the current president of Now. Lindsay Hobbs is a freelance editor and writer, and she works with publishers and independent authors. She's got a background in editing right from university onwards. She says that she's passionate about storytelling and, of course, conscious about language. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay.
Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me for this fiction editing workshop. I'm so happy to be here and excited to share some tips and tricks and knowledge with all you folks. Welcome to Fiction Editing. Our agenda for the workshop tonight is we're going to go through the different types of editing very briefly. And then we're going to look at each type in a little bit more depth. And we're going to end with talking about representation and conscious language. The stages of editing generally go in order for a reason, which we'll see. So developmental editing is the first stage. You may also hear it called structural editing or sometimes substantive editing. And then after developmental editing comes line editing, which is sometimes also called stylistic editing, followed by copy editing. And then finally, proofreading is the final stage of the editing process. Developmental editing is going to take up the most real estate in this presentation because it has the most number of facets to consider. Developmental editing is basically looking at big picture storytelling elements. So this is something that you would be looking at doing after you've written your first draft. And it's, first drafts, as I'm sure you all know, tend to be pretty messy and sometimes, well, depending on how you write, might be a little bit all over the place. So a developmental edit looks at how to take your overall story and shape it into its most compelling form. It will look at things like genre, plot, story structure, pacing, setting, world building, characterization, narrative voice, all of those things. It'll look at it as a whole and figure out how best can we tell this story. Once developmental editing has happened and you're happy with the overall structure and shape of your story, then we get into line editing. So line editing is a close read of the work on a sentence level. It looks at things like the authorial versus the character voices, tone of the story, mood, the flow of the language and the rhythm of it, and readability or clarity. Line editing is a really great thing to work on in order to just help hone and polish your writing craft because it is really about sentence level work. Line editing comes copy editing. So copy editing is probably what you think of most of the time when you think of editing. It's like looking for spelling, for grammar, word usage, sentence structure, punctuation, all the little details that can sometimes, pull a reader out of the story if they come across a typo or a word that's used incorrectly. Could be as simple as it's and it, or there and there. So you can kind of see why the stages of editing go in this order because it doesn't really make sense to do a lot of detailed editing of this kind on sections of your manuscript that might be removed or rewritten during a developmental edit. So that's why we start with the big picture and we slowly move to a more grand edit. The other thing that copy editing does is ensure consistency in style and content. So this is really helpful for fiction editors in terms of character and setting to make sure that, you don't have a character named Sarah who has an H on the end of her name one chapter and then doesn't 2 chapters later, or that somebody has famously in Bram somebody has blue eyes at the beginning and brown eyes halfway through. So copy editing is something that will ensure consistency in both the way you style your language and words and also in the actual content. Proofreading is the final stage, and that term is often used interchangeably with copy editing. But technically speaking, Proofreading takes place after the manuscript has been formatted for publication. That's the big difference between proofreading and copy editing. Proofreading looks not only at the text itself, but also at the way it is laid out on the page. So you're looking for the layout, you're looking for accuracy, readability, and also adherence to design specifications. And it's true, copy edits do miss some things, and sometimes also errors are introduced during the formatting stage, especially in spacing. So that proofreading keeps an eye on. Or if you have something, this is fiction editing, so you probably aren't going to have captioned photos in your book, but that type of thing falls into proofreading. And especially if you're thinking of self-publishing, proofreading is a really important step, because if you're self-editing and self-publishing, you're looking at your work over and over, reading it for many different passes. And what happens is our brain actually wired to take the most accessible neural pathways to get the result they want. So what I mean by that is, you know what you're trying to say with your book. You know how the story goes. You know what the sentences are saying. So if there's an error there, your brain is probably going to skip over it because it already knows the intended meaning of the sentence. So proofreading, we dive deeper into that in a little bit. I can teach you some tools and tricks to hopefully circumvent your brain doing that. And then very briefly, I know this is about editing your own fiction, but this is relevant because so a full edit is what it sounds like. The editor will read your entire manuscript. They will offer an editorial report with a summary of their feedback, and they will also offer comments and suggestions within the manuscript itself. Another service that an editor might offer is just the editorial report, or sometimes it's called a manuscript assessment. So then you don't get the specific examples and things pulled out in comments in the actual manuscript, you just get the summary. So this is, of course, a much cheaper option, and it can help you to sort of understand at a baseline what types of things you need to be looking for when you go through and do your self-edit, things that the editor will have flagged for you in their report, and then you can go through and find those within your own manuscript and work on them. Likewise, some editors, not all, but some editors will offer a partial edit. So they might edit, say, a chapter or two of your manuscript, and then you can take the feedback that you've received from that and again apply your manuscript as a whole. Partial edits, for obvious reasons, work better on the more granular stages of editing. It's really hard, it's impossible to do a partial edit for a developmental edit because you need to see the whole picture if you're going to be giving developmental feedback. But partial edits can be really helpful for line editing and for copy editing. So those are just some things to be aware of. And you are thinking of self-editing a manuscript, but you're feeling like a little bit daunted, like maybe you want still a little bit of feedback from a professional editor, then those are things you can look for rather than paying for a full edit. You can look for either the editorial report or the partial edit. Okay, let's dive into developmental editing, how to edit your overall story. So, what kind of writer are you? And why does that matter? So you've maybe heard the terms plotter and pantser. Those are terms that are used often to describe whether you're a writer who likes to outline or whether you're a writer who likes to make it up as they go along. And one type isn't better than the other, and you might not fall all the way on one, or you might fall into somewhere in between, or it might depend on your project, which type of writer you are. But generally, I have found that people tend to lean towards one way of writing or the other. And as I said, there's no one right way to write a book, of course. So one isn't better than the other, but it can be really helpful when you're looking at your manuscript with an editorial eye to understand what are. So if you are a discovery writer or a pantser, or I've also heard this termed a gardener, you probably have something small, some small sort of seed that you start with. So it could be an image, a scene, a character, a little plot bunny, and you're not quite sure where it's going to go, but you know it's going to go somewhere, and the only way to get it out is to sit down and just start writing it. I see that Shan says, I'm a plantser. And yes, that is also a term I have heard, or plantser is another way to term that. On the other hand, if you are a plotter, also known as an outliner or an architect, then you probably outline your entire book before you start writing. So you know the timelines, you know the characters, the story arcs, you definitely know the ending, and that's how you start, and you take the big picture and you work your way in. So why does this matter when you're looking at your book from an editorial perspective? It matters because knowing what kind of writer you are helps you to understand where the weak parts of your story are most likely to be found. So if you are a discovery writer, then you might need to go back and ask yourself questions to flesh out dead spots. Because when you start with just a seed and you're not sure where it's going to go, your story tends to get richer and richer and more thought out and have both more depth and more breadth into it. So by the time you get to the end, you've probably got this amazing fleshed out story, and then you're probably going to need to go back to the beginning when you weren't quite sure what was happening and make sure that everything lines up and that there's nothing missing. It might be a little bit more spare or bare bones at the beginning. So that's something to watch out for if you are a discovery writer. If you're an outliner, there's probably a good chance that you might tend to info dump. So if you're not familiar with the term info dump, I mean provide a lot of information in a block of text rather than weaving it into the story. So that's something that top-down writers or outliners or plotters tend to do because they've just got all this knowledge of their world and their story right off the bat, and they just want to, so info dumping is something to watch out for if you're a plotter. And sometimes all of that information isn't needed all at once and you can spread it out. Sometimes all that information isn't grounded in character action and you can find different or better ways to weave it in. So knowing what kind of a writer you are is a really great way to start when you are looking at developing craft. Now we're going to talk about theme. You'll have to forgive me for soapboxing about theme for a moment, because another really useful way of assessing your manuscript and whether or not it's saying the things you want it to say and doing what you want it to do is by looking at it in terms of both a narrative question and a thematic question. But before we talk about this, I just want to take a moment to talk about theme. So if you've ever taken a literature class, like be it high school, university, college, online, whatever, you've had the idea of theme drummed into you probably. And generally speaking, it's not a term I love because it can be pretty reductive. But as I said, when doing a developmental edit, it can be helpful to think about. So theme is generally understood to be an idea explored in a work. And one of the reasons why writers and teachers love themes is because they're intended to be general. And so that means that they're meant to connect with a wide range of readers. So we often hear about universal themes that transcend time and cultures and that connect us all as human beings. So some examples of universal themes might be love or grief or family. And this is why I think the topic of themes is a little bit thorny. We also need to be aware that themes are very, very subjective. So people will come to a book with different life experiences and identities, and those things will inform how they interpret a text. So even though love, grief, and family might be things that most human beings will experience, representations of them are not going to look the same for everyone. And further to that, readers will pick up on themes in a novel that you didn't intend to put in there at all, which is, I think, is great. I think that's part of the magic of both reading and writing, but it boils down to themes being not quite as straightforward as your high school English teacher might have led you to believe. And so what this means for us as writers is that I think we have to balance between awful and also not attaching too much to the way people receive it. Because if we try for, this idea of true universality in themes, then what can happen is we can end up generalizing so much that we lose all meaning. And it's okay to write a specific theme that's going to resonate with a specific reader. And it's also okay to write something and have people make meaning from it that might be totally different to what you intended. So all that, thank you for indulging my little soapboxing about theme. We can now take a look at narrative and thematic questions. So the narrative question of your book is, what does the reader wants to find out? Why they keep reading, why they're turning the pages. And some of the questions you can ask yourself when you're looking at your manuscript in terms of the narrative are, when does the narrative question appear in the story? Do I have something in my first chapter, in my first paragraph, in my first section? When does this thing that the reader wants to know first show up? And is it soon enough? Because sometimes what I see in manuscripts is that the narrative question appears too late in the story, and you've lost the point. The reader doesn't have a reason to keep turning the pages. So figuring out when the start of your story is can be a tricky thing to do. And narrative question is one of the things that you can use to gauge where does the story actually start. Another question you can ask about narrative question is the narrative question strong enough to sustain the reader's interest for the length of whatever storytelling? So this is why you see large, epic fantasies usually have narrative questions that are pretty big. It's is the world going to be destroyed? Because that's a pretty big narrative question, and that's going to sustain the reader's interest for the length of an epic fantasy. If you tried to write an epic fantasy with a narrative question that was is my protagonist going to be able to make themselves a sandwich? They're really hungry. It's probably not going to sustain your epic fantasy novel of 1,000 pages. It will probably sustain a short story, but not an epic. So checking in with your narrative question, seeing if it's strong enough to sustain the reader's interest for the length of the story that you are telling. And then the big one, is the narrative question answered by the end of the story? And if it's not answered by the end of the story, your reader's going to be a real man. So those are some ways to look at your draft through the lens of narrative questions. Now, the thematic question is not what happens, but why is it worth thinking about this? So generally speaking, while the narrative question is explicitly answered, the thematic question is not. Instead, the question invites the reader to think through their responses and their interpretations, and therefore the reader is able to become part of the story in that way. So again, if you think about going back to my example of epic fantasy and the Lord of the Rings, for example, so the narrative question would be, is Frodo going to succeed in throwing the ring into, destroying the ring and saving the world? And that get answered. But underlying that question are a lot of thematic questions about the nature of good and evil and, power structures and friendship and, relationships. And so those questions aren't going to get answered in any explicit way. Because if we explicitly answer the thematic question, then we risk dictating some kind of moral lesson to the reader, which could be your intention. Speaking, that's not something that readers enjoy. And it is far better to engage with the reader by getting them to think about their answers to the questions. So I have next a little exercise for everybody to try. So if hopefully you have something to a pen and paper, or you're able to type on your computer while watching this. And apologies if you're not familiar with Frankenstein. I tried to pick something that I thought would be pretty well known, but if you're not that familiar with Frankenstein, to be able to take a stab at its narrative question and its thematic question, feel free to choose another book that you are familiar with, and just take a couple of minutes and write down for yourself what you think the narrative question and the thematic question is for Frankenstein. I'm going to go ahead and show you what my answers to the questions were. And there's no right or wrong answers here. It's just a matter of interpretation. My narrative question for Frankenstein, I have two. What is Frankenstein's creature capable of, and will he find the belonging that he craves? And what price will Frankenstein pay for creating this life? And thematic question, what is the nature of humanity, and how do we treat those perceived as falling outside of it? So again, no right or wrong answer, but you can see in terms of narrative question, those are questions that have explicit answers, and the thematic question isn't. So hopefully that helps people to get the sense of what I mean by narrative and thematic questions, and you can take that and apply that to your own manuscript. I want to move on now. When you're looking at your manuscript as a developmental editor, form and content is one of the things that you need to consider. And by form and content, what I mean is, what is the story I'm telling, and am I telling it in the way best suited to its needs? So there's different ways that you can choose to tell your story. And there's probably going to be, you could probably drive yourself a little bit up the wall trying to overthink this too much. But one of the ways that we can look at form and content is in terms of scene and summary. So this is basically, in a nutshell, deciding which things are important enough to draw the reader's attention to, and deciding which things need to happen in order to move things along, but aren't necessarily crucial for the reader to see and experience with the characters. So when we watch something play out before our eyes, that is a scene. It happens in real time. It's like watching a scene in a movie. When something would take much longer to happen, of it takes, that is narrative summary. So it moves past things quickly, it skips or pauses time. And these are the typical building blocks of your story. There are other techniques as well that you can use, but not as common. So one would be dilation, which is kind of the opposite of summary, where you really zoom in on something. And so, for example, if you took 2 pages to describe someone turning their head to the side, that would be dilation, because it takes much less time to turn your head to the side than it does to read 2 pages. I think of dilation like that scene in The Matrix where Keanu Reeves is all in slow motion, and the bullets are like coming at him really slowly. And there can also be gaps. So gaps are white spaces where time passes off stage. So you might have like a chapter break or a section break, and 10 years passes or 20 years passes. So when we think about the passage of time in terms of how we are presenting different elements of our story, some of the things you can ask yourself are, if you are in scene, does this moment deserve the stage, or can we move quickly past this with narrative summary? If it feels like it's taking forever for things to happen in your manuscript, then you might not be making enough use of narrative summary. You might be falling into the trap of describing absolutely everything and every transition, and, the person leaving their house and walking to the car and getting in the car and turning on the car and putting it in reverse. And that kind of detail isn't necessary. On the other hand, if you have then you can keep the reader at arm's length and prevent connection with the characters in the story. So ask yourself, if you've got a lot of summary and a lot of narration of things happening rather than experiencing things happening, does depicting this in summary prevent the reader from engaging with the characters or the plot? So another example from a classic novel would be, think about Pride and Prejudice, if you are familiar with that. Mr. Darcy's proposal to Lizzie in real time? Of course we do. Because imagine how disconnected you would feel from that romance plot if there was just a sentence that said, later on, Mr. Darcy went to visit Elizabeth and proposed to her, and she said no. Instead of seeing him tell her all his feelings and seeing her outrage and her sassy comebacks, like, that's very, very important in order to connect with that story. Likewise, there is a part in Pride and Prejudice where Lizzie has to go on a 4-hour carriage ride with her two very silly younger sisters. And Jane Austen very rightly just tells us that happens and moves along. But you can imagine the tediousness of having to read if she had written that in scene, and you had to spend those 4 hours with Lizzie listening to that inane conversation with her silly younger sisters. Slowed the novel down, and it would have bored the reader to tears. So scene and summary is balancing scene and summary is key to pacing of your story, and it's also about indicating to the reader what things they need to be paying attention to. This next slide I actually just added in at the last minute because this is something I saw on Twitter today. It's from the writer KJ Charles, who was a romance writer, and she wrote, if you're struggling to write a transitional scene because it feels like boring filler before the good bit, 1, consider that it might, in fact, be boring filler before the good bit. 2, write the good bit. 3, see if anything actually needs filling in. Bet it doesn't. So the other aspect of this is trusting your reader. Your reader will fill in the boring bits. You don't have to show everything. You can confidently skip the boring bits and know that your reader is going to follow along. Okay, moving on from the scene and summary to talk a little bit about character. So one way to approach character when developmental editing is by looking at the character's arc. So there are 3 broad types of character arcs. All of them change, because change, as we all know, is at the heart of a good story. And because character arcs are all inextricably linked to plot, because they are about change. So in a positive character arc, the character usually begins by being unhappy in some way. So they might be unfulfilled. You often hear about the idea of the character of a story believing some kind of lie. So they might be believing a lie, they might be in denial, they're generally unhappy. And then the events of the story force them to reckon with some kind of truth of their situation and rise to meet some kind of challenge. And then by the end, they're better off for having changed. That's the general positive character arc. The negative arc is the opposite of that. It's about failure. The character may not discover the truth that they seek, or the character may discover it and reject it. So the negative character arc is all about self-destruction. And then you have the flat character arc, which actually isn't an arc, it's more of a straight line. And the flat character arc is usually about saving others. So these characters go through major changes because they already possess some quality that is special, or they already know an important truth. So in a flat arc, it is not change in the character that overcomes obstacles, but rather their steadfastness, which overcomes the obstacles. So some of the questions you can ask yourself about character arcs is, what change is happening in my story? Do my characters change, and if so, how? Do my characters' decisions have consequences that advance the plot? And at any point, does my character stay stuck in the same emotional beat for too long? So I will say that I am currently reading a book that is a debut novel. It was just released. I was very excited about it. It's a fantasy romance, and it is really, really annoying me because the main character is just stuck in the same emotional beat. I'm happy with the story, and she has not shifted yet. And so what we end up having is scene after scene of this character thinking the same thing, feeling the same thing, worrying about the same thing, expounding to the reader on the same thing. And it gets really, really frustrating. So that things, like I said, plot and character are inexplicably linked. So the changes in your character need to be moving along with the changes in your story. And so you should always keep your character's arc in mind as well as your story arc when you're looking at your manuscript from a developmental perspective. And I've got another fun little exercise for you guys. Just take a couple of minutes and write down what kind of character arcs you think these characters have. And if there are any that you're not familiar with, you can just skip them. I'm going to go ahead and show you and again, they're my answers that are, you can again interpret things differently. Oh, I've got number 2 is a trick question. That's interesting. So Sherlock Holmes is a classic example of a flat character arc. Sherlock Holmes is one of those characters that he's already special. He doesn't change. You don't see him, adapted, but in the Conan Doyle books, he's very steadfast and the same throughout every story. You find this a lot with detective fiction. I would say Poirot is another really good example of a flat character. You don't ever really see Poirot having a lot of strong emotions other than about his little gray cells. Jay Gatsby I have as a negative arc. I would be curious about, Graham, your interpretation of Jay Gatsby. Frodo Baggins is the trick question. Mixed arcs are yes, also a thing. So I kind of was unfair to you there. Frodo, you could argue, really, I feel like you could argue him of any of the 3. Macbeth is pretty clear. Macbeth is a tragedy. He is all about self-destruction. And Ebenezer Scrooge is also pretty obvious. The guy has a pretty big redemption arc, positive. Jane Eyre, I think, is another example of a flat arc. Although, again, you could argue that, but I think that Jane's ability to sustain all of her traumas is due to the fact that she is such a steadfast, unchanging character who already possesses an important truth about life and about herself. And then Jaime Lannister, I said positive because in the books, at least, Jaime Lannister also has a fantastic redemption arc. And I know that the show maybe did him wrong, but he's got one of the best redemption arcs in books that I have read. And Shan also says, I think Flashman is another flat character arc. And yes, the show did him so wrong. All right, so we'll move on from character arcs. You can think about forward momentum in your plot being caused by a domino effect. So something happens in a scene, which causes a response, which causes the next scene. However, you want to be clear that causal connections in your story, although they're crucial, they don't have to be so literal. They can happen on different levels of your story. And so the writer Shaylin Bishop has a really great video on YouTube, and I've linked it in the resources at the end of this presentation. She describes scenes of story in relation to causal connections. She talks about the concrete plane, which is anything that is physically happening in the story. So this is events, dialogue, action, and setting, anything that's physically happening. And then there's the internal plane, which is what is happening inside the minds of the characters. So this would be emotion, internal conflict, desires, thoughts, motivations, interpretations, like anything going on. And then finally, there's the metaphorical plane, which is perceptible to the reader, but not explicitly stated and not typically known to the characters. So we're talking about symbolism, metaphor, ideas, getting back to that concept of theme that we were looking at earlier. So I know that's a lot to take in, but all that to say that when I talk about causal connections, I don't mean to say that they all have to happen on the concrete. Sometimes they do. If you're writing a really plot-heavy book, like for example, if you're writing a spy thriller, probably most, if not all of your causal connections do take place on the concrete plane. So something happens in scene A, which leads to something happening in scene B. But if you're writing a more character-driven story, then the causality might be more internal. So for example, the event that happens in scene A would cause the character to feel a certain way, which would in turn cause them to act a certain way, which would then cause scene B. Lots of different kinds of causal connections, but they still need to be there. They need to be in your story to create that domino effect. Otherwise, what you end up with is just a series of things happening to the same character, but that's not a plot. That's just a whole bunch of things happening. And it's very different. It lands very differently than when you can trace this causal chain through your story. To this a little bit more in the next slide, which is connected to this idea. So this is the concept of setup and payoff. So even though I just encouraged you to think of your story like dominoes, I'm now changing the visual for all you visual thinkers out there, and asking you to think of it like a multi-thread weave or a braid. So if you start feeding in a bunch of threads at the beginning and then they don't go anywhere, then your braid's going to get real messy. Ideally, you want to pick up each thread or strand, continually be braiding it into the whole so that all of the events and all of the emotional shifts in the story make sense and feel earned. If your threads don't go anywhere, then you leave the reader hanging, waiting for their significance, and that can be really, really frustrating. And it works in the reverse as well. So if you haven't braided in enough threads and all of a sudden you've got this big change near the end, but like no foundation was laid for it, then it feels cheap. It feels like it wasn't earned. The reader's probably going to be annoyed. It's like those murder mysteries where all of a sudden you get the solution and it all hinges on something that you never were told. Those are really unfair to the reader and are really unsatisfying. This idea of setup and payoff is connected to the idea of the causal chain. So it's worth looking at the moments of major change in your story and in your characters and tracing them backwards to ensure that they're earned, to ensure that you can follow that causal chain to see the moment where it makes sense that that character changed or whatever that event was in your story happening is happening. And it's equally important to read the beginning section of your story, see if you've introduced anything that never went anywhere. And if it doesn't go anywhere, then you can ask yourself, does this really need to be here? Why have I introduced this thread into the braid that doesn't wind up having significance? So the two main questions here to ask yourself are, is there anything set up that doesn't pay off? And are there any payoffs that don't feel earned? Using Pride and Prejudice as an example, the Bennet sisters at the beginning of the novel know that their only hope for the future is advantageous marriage. Because that's their only hope for the future, they're going to throw them into the path of two rich men who have just arrived in the neighborhood. Because their mother is very obviously throwing them in the path of these two rich men, Darcy, who is one of the two rich men, is disdainful of them because he thinks they're fortune hunters. And so then that causes him to not care about their feelings and to insult Lizzie where she can hear him. Because Darcy insulted her, Lizzie feels angry and she feels hurt, which makes sense. And because she's angry and hurt, then she's willing to believe the lies that Wickham tells her about Darcy, even though Wickham is manipulating her. So you can imagine this if it wasn't clearly laid out like this. So for example, if Lizzie had met Wickham before she met Darcy, or if she had met Darcy first, but he'd been super lovely and charming and he hadn't insulted her, then the reader might be really, really confused about why Wickham's lies about him, considering that both of them are relative strangers to her. However, since we can follow this causal chain and trace it on both the concrete plane and the internal plane, it makes perfect sense to the reader why Lizzie behaves the way she does. So of course, that's only the very, very beginning of Pride and Prejudice. We'd be here all night if I traced the causal chain through the whole book, but you can get a sense of how it works. I'm going to leave you developmental editing tool of my top tool for developmental editing is to make a table or a chart. So I've made a sample one here for one of my favorite books, Gaudy Night by Dorothy L. Sayers. And a table or a chart is a really great way of tracking things in your manuscript and seeing it laid out in an overview. So seeing it laid out in the overview can help you to see both events of the plot and the structure of it. So you can see in this sample, I've got the chapter, a chapter summary, the number of scenes in a chapter, which might not be necessary. Gaudy Night has multi-scene chapters, but most books don't. So you might not need that. Number of words, which I always round out. Point of view character, especially if you're in a book with multiple point of view characters, you probably want that. I've also got a quotation because it moves around, and then notes. But you can customize your table for whatever you're working on. So like I said, it probably doesn't make sense for most books to have number of scenes in the chapter, but you might want to include something like a column for time, especially if you're working with a non-linear timeline. Or if you're working in a specific genre, like say you're writing a mystery, you might want to include a column for clues and hearings. Or if you're writing a mystery, you might want to include a column for key relationship developments. So you can really customize this however you want. Or if you look at this chart and want to run screaming, you can think about different ways to look at your story broadly. So lists, maps, timelines that you can embellish, these can all be really helpful. The main idea here is just the way the big picture is created by the small details, and see the way the small details map onto the overall structure of the story. So I like a good table, but this is definitely something to make your own when you're working on your own manuscript. All right. Whew, that was a lot. And like I said at the beginning, mental editing is, there's a lot to it, because it's basically, we're looking at storycraft and literary theory and all kinds of stuff, and pulling apart things that you're probably doing intuitively and trying to analyze them, which can be a little bit daunting. So thank you for bearing with me through my developmental editing part. We're going to move on to line editing, and I've got a few more exercises in this section that I think you guys are going to find really fun. So moving on to line editing, how to edit your sentences. So sentence length and rhythm. This is so important. I have a quote here by Ursula K. Le Guin, who, in addition to being a great novelist and short story writer, is also a prolific novelist, has some really great writing craft books out there. If you haven't checked those out, I have linked to one in the resources at the end. But she says, every sentence has a rhythm of its own, which is also part of the rhythm of the whole piece. Rhythm is what keeps the song going, the horse galloping, the story moving. So, a lot of short sentences in a row will make for a very choppy rhythm. Complex sentences, on the other hand, can be more interesting to read, but you also have to be really careful when you're crafting complex sentences, because they can get muddied, and it's really easy to create a very complex sentence that ends up being difficult to read. So we have to really watch out that complex sentences are crafted with care. But the most important thing is variety in sentence length and structure. That's what's going to keep your writing compelling and interesting, and it's going to help with the rhythm and the flow. Punctuation is really key here. Where you punctuate your sentences and creates the points of pause and of impact for the reader. And as you all know, there's a plethora of punctuation to choose from out there. I am a really firm believer in turning off your computer's spell and grammar check while writing, if you write on a computer. Any glaring issues that come up with spelling or grammar can be corrected during the copy editing stage, so I wouldn't even worry. And for now, you want to trust your instincts in terms of rhythm and flow, and grammar checks in particular will always try to dumb down your sentences and try to make them the most simplistic as possible, which is sometimes what you want, but is sometimes not what you want. So that's my little plug for turning off your spell and grammar check when you're writing. Okay, I have taken an excerpt from another excellent book called Kitchen, which is translated from Japanese by an author named Banana Yoshimoto. And I have removed all of the punctuation from this excerpt. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to rewrite this excerpt. Go wild with your punctuation. I'm going to go ahead and show you what the original text looks like. I will read it out with the pauses that were intended. The place I like best in this world is the kitchen. No matter where it is, no matter what kind, if it's a kitchen, if it's a place where they make food with me. Ideally, it should be well broken in. Lots of tea towels, dry and immaculate. White tile catching the light. Ting, ting. So, of course, your version might be totally different, which is completely fine. But that is how the author originally punctuated. Punctuation and rhythm, just so key to having prose that is enjoyable to read and also allows the reader to be not only in the, how do I want to say this? When you're in the flow of the language, you're in the flow of the story. If there's something that is for example, just like tons of short sentences that are all the same length, all in a row, starring to the ear. You can hear it in your mind when you're reading it. There's been actually a really interesting study that says that the brain processes things read aloud and read silently in pretty much the exact same way. So you can get really distracted by the language of a story if the rhythm is off. So punctuation is your best friend, is the takeaway here. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about point of view and head hopping. So this is for people who have multiple point of view. Oh, Shan has a really great point. Rhythm will be understood differently by deaf readers. That is very true. Thank you for pointing that out, Shan. I don't have any experience with deaf writers, but that's a really great point to make. Okay. So if you have multiple point of view characters, then one thing you have to really watch out for is what's known as head hopping. So head hopping means that you're switching between point of view characters without making the moment of the switch clear. It's a really common issue in first drafts. And so it's really disorienting to the reader, and it's very confusing because all of a sudden you're in somebody else's mind and you didn't realize, and sometimes it doesn't make sense. And you're like, well, how does this person know that? Or why would they say that? So it's really important if you're switching between point of view characters to make the switch clear. And some of the ways you can do that are having a break between point of view characters. So a chapter break, a section break, even like an extra space between paragraphs. And by making the pattern of the changes fairly consistent. So not having, for example, like 12 chapters from one POV and then one from somebody else's and then one from the first ones again and then 6 from the next ones. That can also be a little bit disorienting and confusing. So you can ask yourself, how often does the point of view change? Is the pattern of changes fairly consistent? Is the switch between point of view characters clear? And also, you can ask yourself why you're choosing to switch point of view in that moment. So, of course, if you only have one viewpoint character, then that's going to allow for greater in your knowledge of that character and in the experience of the reader getting to know that character. Whereas if you have multiple viewpoint characters, that's going to give your readers a greater breadth of your world and of the story from that sense. So it all depends on what it is you're going for, what you're trying to do with your story. However, if you do have multiple viewpoint characters, you need to ask yourself, in point of view, why you're doing it, because sometimes it can be tempting to take the easy way out by switching point of view and jumping around rather than portray a character's thoughts and experiences from outside their perspective. But it can also dilute tension when you do that, because it then makes everyone, or if you're jumping between characters so that you can say, oh, well, I want the reader to know about this, so I'm going to jump over to this character, then you also have to have a really good reason for withholding information when you're doing that too. So there's a lot to think about with multiple POV characters, but basically asking yourself if you're taking the easy way out by switching point of view, or if it's really serving the story, and how are you doing the switches between point of view. And that way you shall avoid the dreaded head hopping. All right, next up we have filter words. So this might be a concept that some of you are already familiar with. Filter words are words that remind your reader that they are being told something rather than experiencing it. So I've got some examples listed here: realized, noticed, thought, wondered, decided. And so when you use filter words like this, then you're increasing what is known as psychic distance or narrative distance, which is the distance between the reader and the character. So that's not always bad, and it might be what you're intending to do. But if you're not using them with intention, then it could be that you're losing a sense of for the reader in your story. So unless you're intentionally wanting to remind the reader that they're being told something rather than experiencing it, then you can probably do away with these words, and your prose is going to have a lot more immediacy and be a lot more like potent. So if you consider the sentence, or the sentences, I noticed the sky and I realized that it was getting darker. I thought a storm was coming. Compared to the sky was getting darker, a storm was coming. You can see how the filter words really dilute that expression. So when you look at your prose and your text, you can ask yourself, do I unintentionally use filter words, or am I doing this with intention? And does this scene need more immediacy, in which case I can get rid of filter words, or does this scene need more distance? So maybe something really intense has just happened and you want a breather, you want to like bring some distance in, then you might want to keep some filter words in. So as long as you're using them with intention, as I said, they're not necessarily bad, but a lot of times they sneak in there unintentionally, and then they just start diluting everything down. So here's another exercise for you, and I feel terrible about this one because I've taken this excellent book called Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, and I have just butchered this passage of it by adding in a whole bunch of... So once again, I'm going to give you 3 minutes to have a go at removing any unnecessary filter words from this passage. Here is the original text. Another crash, wood dropped against stone to splinter apart. His stomach lurched. He had to stop her. Felt his way around the bench, leg throbbing, and took the 19 remaining strides to the shelf. Ignoring her, he reached out and ran a hand along the place where his forest creations normally sat. It was empty. So you can see how much stronger that language is than my terrible version with all of the filter words added, with apologies to Rebecca Roanhorse. Keeping an eye out for filter words is a great tip to strengthen your prose in general. And along those lines, I'm going to talk a little bit about specificity and clarity. When we're talking about prose that is interesting and compelling to read, specificity is your best friend. Specificity will always make your prose more interesting. In addition to making it more original, it's also really, really hard to visualize things that are vague. So you're not going to be painting a picture for the reader in the same way that you will be if you are using vague language rather than specific language or concrete language. So if we think about classifying language broadly into 3 categories, so vague language would refer to words that don't have any set, and they could refer to multiple things. So I'm talking about words like some, it, thing, quite, was, did. Like these are all vague words, and they could refer to lots of different things. In the middle, you have abstract language, which refers to words that do have a set definition, but they're things with no physical form. You can't access them with your senses. So they could be emotions, ideas, states, qualities. So that would be abstract language. And then finally, we have concrete language, which refers to words that have a set definition and refer to something physical and sensory. So when you're looking at your writing, you can ask yourself, have I described the how, not just the what? And have I used words that don't describe something specific? So this is going to invite you to dig a little bit deeper and find some more specific details that are going to make your writing more interesting and more vivid, and also more unique, because it's in the specific details that your own voice is going to shine through more. The other aspect to making your words really work for you is less about word choice and more about sentence structure. So this is clarity. And lack of clarity is perhaps the number one barrier for a reader. And unclear prose comes most often when you've used a lot of complex sentences or poetic language. And I don't want you to get me wrong, because I am a huge fan of both complex sentences and poetic language. But it doesn't matter how beautiful your metaphors are if your sentence isn't clear. So unless your prose is clear, the beauty of it isn't going to be effective. And this might mean that sometimes you might have to simplify your sentence structure or your word choice, or it might mean that you need to brush up on some grammar that you've forgotten. And I've linked a great book about common grammatical mistakes in the resources at the end, because that happens where someone's got a very long poetic sentence, but it's mixed up in its object verb agreement or something like that, so it doesn't quite make sense, and then you end up stumbling over it. So if you find ever that you have to reread any of your sentences, then you should probably be taking a red pen to those sentences, because clarity is the number one important thing for the reader. So again, the question you can ask yourself there is, do any of my sentences need to be read more than once to understand their meaning? And this can be tricky because, again, of what I said at the beginning when we were talking about proofreading, about how the brain tends to fill in those gaps. This is where something like a beta reader can come in really handy. So beta readers are people who will read your first draft or read your scripts at any pre-publication stage and give you their feedback. And that would be a great thing to, specify if you think that might be something that you do. Then if you have a beta reader, you can always say, hey, I'd like you to keep a special eye out for this. Are there any sentences that are unclear that you had to read more than once? So specificity and clarity. And then I've got one more writing exercise for you. This is the last one of these, but it is also the most fun. So I have once again taken a beautiful book, Zamie, A New Spelling of My Name by Audre Lorde, and I have butchered it by replacing a lot of her specificity and concrete language with vague language. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to have fun with this, because this is really where your creative writing is going to, as opposed to your grammar or editing. Because I'm going to ask you to fill this in with your own specificity and concrete language details. Okay, I'm going to show you the original text now. I ran to the corner to fetch milk and bread from the short next door man, stopping to search for some blades of grass to bring home for my mother, stopping to search for hidden pennies winking like kittens under the subway gratings. I was always bending over to tie my shoes, delaying, trying to figure out something. How to get at the money, how to peep out the secret that some women carried like a swollen threat under the gathers of their flowered blouses. So obviously you can see how much more vivid that writing is with the inclusion of more specific details and more concrete language. It's like night and day. My biggest tip for you, my biggest line editing tool, very, very high-tech tool, it's reading your work out loud. It's the best thing that you can do in order to hear the rhythm of your language, in order to hear if there's any places that you stumble. It's going to be a lot easier to catch those sentences that you do have to reread over again when you're reading them out loud than it is when you're reading them silently. And it's also a tool that you can use when copy editing and proofreading, because you're more likely to catch little typos as well reading out loud. So that's my big hack for line editing for you. Read your work out loud. If you've never tried it, you'd be surprised at what a difference it makes to hear it spoken as opposed to reading it silently. So we're going to move on now to copy editing and proofreading. So how to edit your language, or how to edit your nitty-gritty little details. So by the time you get to copy editing, if you have been doing your own editing for every stage of your manuscript, you've probably read it about 100 million times by this point. So it's really key to try to see your words with fresh eyes. And the number one thing I can recommend is, if possible, take some time away. Take as much time away as you possibly can, so that you don't have those same lines burned into your retinas in the same way. And being able to see your words with fresh eyes, it's not only an issue for people self-editing, it's an issue for editors in general, which is a lot of times I won't work on, for example, proofreading a manuscript that I have line edited, because I know that it's going to be better for the author to get someone different to look at the proofread or the copy edit stage, because that person might catch things that I missed. But having said that, if you're doing it yourself, here are some things you can try other than taking some time away. So again, reading it out loud, which we already talked about. Read your manuscript on paper instead of on a screen, and read your manuscript on a screen instead of on paper. So there's always, there's a big debate over whether or not reading on paper is superior to reading on a screen. It's a debate that's ongoing. I don't really have a strong opinion about it, but I do acknowledge that they are different reading experiences. So if you're looking at this with the copy editing eye, you're going to want to do multiple passes and from as many different angles as possible. So as tedious as it might be to comb over your manuscript again and again, that is what copy editing is. So I would recommend doing both. Read your manuscript on paper and read it on a screen. And there's pros to both. Editing on paper is distraction-free. You don't have the internet at your fingertips. It's easier to do a little bit at a time and take breaks. And it's easier to see visibly how far you've traveled throughout the manuscript as your pile of pages that you've turned over grows. There are even studies that suggest that when you do that and read on paper and can have that visible record of how far you've traveled in the book, the mind more easily reads the book, which aids in its navigation. So those are just some of the things about editing on paper. On the other hand, editing on screen is less of a mess. It's less of a, less paper use. It's easier to make use of editing tools. I would also say, if you're doing this, something as simple as changing the font can make a difference to how you see it. How do you see the words? Something as changing the spacing. So, change it to like a wide double space and put it in a different font than you've typed it in. And something like that can help you to see it with fresh eyes. I see Leanne has a question here about, can you have one editor for all stages of editing, or best to have a specialist for each one if you're hiring editors? You can, it's really, it's a choice. Like I said, I will together certain types of editing. So I would be fine for example, doing a developmental edit and then doing one of the more granular edits, like a line or copy edit. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive in my mind. And sorry, I just saw Shan's comment. I know someone who writes their first draft with the wingdings. It keeps them from editing on the fly when they're trying to power out that first draft. That is amazing. I'm going to tuck that into my back pocket. Thank you. I love that. But okay, sorry, back to Leanne's question. I think it is beneficial that when you get down to the very granular types of editing, copy editing and proofreading, that you have as many different eyes as possible, or that you can afford. That's my personal opinion. Some editors will do it. I will often combine a line edit and a copy edit, not even as two different passes, just as one general pass, because it's hard. I find it hard to separate those two, because when I'm working at the sentence level, I'm also going to be addressing spelling, grammar, and usage. So those are two types of edits that I often combine. But if I did that, then I would probably say to someone, I recommend you get a different editor for proofreading if you're hiring editors. Okay. Oh, Graham's cutting out early. No worries. See you later, Graham. Thanks for coming. So establishing a consistent style. This is another thing that's really key in the copy edit stage. So again, by the time you get to this stage, you're going to be at a place in your manuscript where you're not making any more big changes. So you've done the developmental edit, you've maybe done the line edit, but this is the stage where you can start to make note of certain decisions and ensure that they're consistently applied across the whole manuscript. So all the spelling of proper nouns, this comes in really a lot if you're writing, say, like a fantasy or sci-fi book and you've got a lot of made up words, to make sure that those are all consistent throughout the story. Things like if you're using numbers, if you've got unusual formats like text messages, letters, emails in your manuscript, how are those going to be treated? Are they, you want to make sure that they're consistent throughout the whole manuscript. And that's one of the things that you do at the copy editing stage. And how you do that is by creating a style sheet. So all copy editors will do this for your manuscript. If you hire a copy editor, it tracks every single decision in regards to things like that. Spelling, capitalization, numbers. For fiction, it will also keep in mind things like character traits and physical descriptions, stuff like that. Usually the author and the editor will agree on a dictionary to use and some basic baseline style decisions, which stops you from having to write down every single spelling of every single word. You can just say, we're using the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, and anything that differs from that, if we choose to use a different spelling for any one word, we'll throw it in our word list so we know that's an exception to the dictionary we're using. So style sheets are a really, really useful tool that you can create for your own manuscript. And in addition to tracking things like the way you're going to use punctuation, so you can see in the sample one I've made here, I've got things like quotation marks in British style, and M and N dash closed, which just means that when I have dashes, I'm not putting spaces on either side of them. So those are the little details that you're really going to want to pay attention to in a copy edit. So in addition to tracking all of that, you can also choose, if you want, to add your own little writer quirks that you have and want to catch onto your style sheet. So if there's a word that you always have to look up to check the spelling or check the usage, then you can put that on your style sheet just as a reminder to yourself that that's something you want to keep an eye out for. So style sheets are a great tool to use when you're copy editing and when you're proofreading. Proofreaders will use your style sheet that the copy editor provides for them. So I'm actually going to leave this exercise for you guys to do later on, because see that time is creeping up on us, but this is something that you can come back to when you'll get the slides from this workshop after. And so it's just to start your own style sheet for your manuscript and create the headings of what you think is important to track what proper nouns occur more than once, what are words I always have to look up to double check, are there any unusual forms, and anything else that you want to track in your sheet. So that is something that you can take away and have fun doing. I use fun loosely. I think creating style sheets are fun. I hope that you do too. And so 2 tools I have for you for copy editing and proofreading. I've got 2 because the first one I feel a little bit bad about because it does cost money. It's a paid software. It's called Perfectit. But if you're going to be doing a lot of your own editing, then you really, really, really recommend it. It is a wonderful consistency and detail checker. And the great thing, with 2 great things about Perfectit, and I swear they're not paying me to say this, but one of them is that it doesn't automatically implement any changes. So even though it will find any inconsistencies or any spellings that are wrong, it won't automatically change them. You still have to go through and manually change them. So it's not going to do anything weird without you knowing about it. And it also gives you an opportunity to find out the things that you are maybe like the things that you're doing over and over again that you want to catch. And the other great thing about Perfectit is that you can upload your own style sheet that you've created to it and have it check using that. So it has built-in style sheets, like it, for example, might have like the Chicago Manual of Style. And you could say, yeah, I want to run a Chicago check, and it'll check for all of the style choices that Chicago recommends. But you can also upload your own style sheet, and then it'll check for the things that you've specified that you want to check for in your manuscript. So it's a really great software, and I highly recommend it if you're going to be doing editing. And then my final tip here is using a ruler when you're proofreading. And a good opaque ruler, so get a wooden one or a metal one, put it underneath the line that you're reading so you can't see anything else except for that one line. And that also does wonders for focusing your brain on that one sentence and being able to find any errors. So those are my 2 tips on 2 tools for copy editing and proofreading. And then we're going to move on to our final brief section, which is about representation and conscious language and how to use your language skills for good and not for evil. This is not something that you might typically find in an editor's repertoire. Conscious language assessment is something that I offer, and I do think that this is a really vital piece of looking at your own work and making sure that it's having the effect that you intend it to have and it's doing what you want it to do and not anything that you don't want it to be doing unintentionally. Starting off with some thoughts on representation and acknowledging that I am talking about this as a person based on a lot of training that I've done and reading that I've done. But as always with these things, like I really encourage you to seek out lots of different voices on these subjects. And again, I've linked some resources at the end. But representation really matters. It matters that diversity is represented in our books, and it matters that we get it right. So some of the questions that we can ask ourselves, especially if writing about identities or groups that are not our own. Am I writing about my lived experience? If not, why is this a story I want to tell, and where am I getting my information from? Are there other authors who might tell this story better? And are those authors marginalized and underrepresented in publishing? So this matters because there are lots and lots of representations of Eurocentric white culture and straight white cis men and women out there. There is an abundance of accurate representations out there, but there are far fewer accurate representations of marginalized cultures, communities, and identities. So when a writer outside of these groups decides to tell these stories, they run the very high risk of misrepresenting them and of displacing them in the publishing arena. So it's just something to keep in mind if this is, if you are writing a story that is not based on your own lived experience. And accuracy builds trust in your readers. Writers are well versed already in the importance of research, so you probably have researched any number of things for your manuscript, be it a historical time period, a location, and it's also important to ensure that you're accurately representing aspects of your book, including depictions of cultures, race, gender and gender identity, disability, religion. And so even if you're not writing, say, like a point of view character or perspective from a group that's not yours, but you have represented diverse characters in your book, which again, I think is great, I think is important. One of the things that you can do is look for an authenticity reader. So authenticity readers are also called sensitivity readers, and they read for accuracy and representation. And so they're basically like a beta reader who looks at your manuscript through a very specific lens. Because the publishing industry, as you can see in the little yellow box here, it's pretty homogenous. So even if a manuscript goes through the entire publishing process and is seen by multiple different agents, editors, marketers, the whole team, issues of representation and authenticity still be missed if there is little diversity among those involved in the process, which there is. So authenticity reading is a great, I think it's a really great service. You can find authenticity readers online who specialize in different areas depending on what their lived experience is. And it is important to note that the feedback of one authenticity reader is not representative of an entire community or demographic. So just because you have the feedback of an authenticity reader doesn't make your manuscript immune to any criticism, but it is still very, very valuable. And then we come to conscious language, which is basically, it's a more granular aspect of this. Oh, it's a great question, Leanne. How can you be sure an authenticity reader is authentic? Great question. And I think to do your due diligence in finding out about that person. It's true that there are lots of, I would say never go through like a third party to hire an authenticity reader. And I don't have links in the resources, but I can send some out when I send the slides about ways to find authenticity readers. I know some really great editors who work in this field, and they've got some tips on how to find authenticity readers and not. Oh, and Shan says, for what it's worth, there's an Indigenous Editors Association. Some sensitivity readers are available there. That's great to know. So yeah, it is, you do have to be really careful when you're looking for authenticity readers, but there are ways to do it. And I will send out some resources about that for sure. In terms of conscious language, language isn't neutral. And it's really important to recognize the fact that many words and idioms in the English language are rooted and invested in lots of oppressive projects. And language can be violent and support oppression, and it can also be intentionally affirming and support liberation. But most of the time where it falls is into the category of unquestioned. So a lot of us are not trying to use language harmful, but we're sometimes doing so because we don't know any better, because these are the words and expressions and phrases that we grew up with. And so if we're not a part of the community that they are harmful to, we might not realize the impact that they have. So this is a visual from CBC Ottawa with some unquestioned language and words that are, contain some about what is valuable and normal and what isn't. So the important thing to remember about conscious language is that it's the conscious part that we want to focus on. So there's a Karen Yin, who created something called the Conscious Language Style Guide, which I'm also going to talk about more in a minute. She has a quote that says, "Good writers consciously use disagreeable language to strike a tone. The goal is not to be nice, inoffensive, or politically correct. Even language intended to be inclusive and considerate might offend. If you're interested in using language consciously, then clarify your intentions and evoke and provoke skillfully." So basically what she's saying is, if you want to use harmful language, which I personally would not want to, but if you're doing that intentionally to provoke, then that's your choice. This is not about censorship. You are free to do that, but understand the impact that your words are going to have and do that intentionally if that's what you're going to do. But it's important for us as writers to know that sometimes we might be using words that are unintentionally harmful, and that's the stuff that we really want to become aware of. So, cultivate an eye for this. Again, I've got resources that I'm going to have for you about this, but keeping up to date on conversations about language and making sure that you're reading opinions by diverse writers. Get interested in the origins of words and phrases. I personally think that etymology is fascinating, and I love learning where words and phrases come from. It's shocking a lot of the time to realize how the origins, how awful they can be. But there's a great podcast called The Illusionist where they dive into the origins of words, and so you can have some fun with finding out about words and phrases and where they come from. I would also say notice when you're having knee-jerk reactions about how language is used. If someone says, "Oh, this phrase is actually really harmful," and you're like, "What? There's nothing wrong with that." Just notice, like, "Oh, why am I getting defensive about that?" And be open to that feedback. In terms of fiction, it's really easy for writers to unconsciously incorporate not only unquestioned language, but also stereotypes. So an example of this would be when white authors introduce characters, they will often only describe the race of non-white characters. So just assuming that like white is the default, we don't have to mention that, but we do have to mention it if someone's not white. I also, so understanding, maybe doing some more reading on harmful stereotypes and harmful tropes, and asking yourself, is my representation of these characters reinforcing those? Using figurative language as a metaphor when it's a real life descriptor. So I see lame all the time to mean something that's ineffectual, and that is ableist language, which is one of the hardest ones I find for myself. I have found that the hardest to become aware of in my own language, but I'm working on it. And this is an ongoing process. So just recognize too that there's no shortcut to doing this work. This is an ongoing process. And then finally, conscious language is just going to make you a better writer, because as we talked about before, specificity and concrete language and, being aware and consciously using your words is what writing is all about. So you're going to be able to avoid cliches, you're going to be able to increase specificity, and just in general, your writing is going to get better if you start cultivating an eye for conscious language. And so my conscious language resource is the Conscious Language. It is a website. It has got tons and tons and tons of great resources there. And there's also, I don't know, I do. So here's my suggested readings and resources. It's on there, the Conscious Language Style Guide. And Writing the Other is also a fantastic website that has tons of resources. And they also have webinars and classes. And so highly recommend that, both of those resources. That is the end of me talking at you. I do apologize because I have only left 12 minutes for questions, but we did answer quite a few along the way. So if anyone has any questions, I'm just going to show you one more slide real quick before I close this off so you can see my face again, this is just a little, I am on my editing website currently launching a giveaway for the next 6 months. I'm going to be off one free short story edit, either a developmental edit or a line edit per month for the next 6 months. And you can find all of the details of that on my website. Any questions? Kathy's asking about the fantastic graphics. Thank you, Kathy. These graphics they were drawn by a very good friend of mine named Gabrielle Haynes. I commissioned them for my website, so they're originals, and she is a very talented artist. She's based in Vancouver, and oh, I've got 2 raised hands. Okay, Leanne, if you want to unmute, perfect.
Lindsay, that was just really an incredible workshop. So thank you. I just got a ton of great information. So generous of you. So thank you. Thank you. My question is about revision marking. Is that like the bane of existence, or like I do it, in my work because I write for clients all the time and it's the way we exchange feedback. But what's your thoughts on that for an editor to be using it or not? Or
so you're talking about like the markup on actual manuscripts?
Yeah, like if you're doing it in Word, which I know people write in all sorts of different platforms, but that's the one I use. And I guess I'm talking from a writer, even as you're going through your first and second drafts, as well as point of view.
Right. So I also work in Word. I use track changes. Is that what you use as well?
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is a bit of a bane sometimes. I get around it mostly by toggling back and forth between the different markup views. So yeah, either showing all the markup or showing the simple markup. But I agree, it can be a bit of a bane. And so sometimes what I'll also do is save different versions. So I might say, okay, I've marked all this up, and maybe I want to save as, say, like copy edited draft, and then accept all the changes. And then I've got that draft over here, but I still have the original. So like you're already doing all of that. But yeah, there's not too many ways around marking up. It's can get messy, but yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Gloria says, my story is from 1898 and features a Native family. At that time, they would be called Indians, and that is what I write in my story before political correctness. I don't wish to be offensive. Wrong to say how we refer to them now. What do you think? Yeah, this is a really, really common question. And Shan says, yes, chances are they were part of a nation. I think that the best thing you can do with a story like that is to run it by sensitivity readers. That would be my feedback. Because I understand your concern about it seems anachronistic to use a contemporary terminology, but Shan has a great alternative there. And yeah, I think that sensitivity readers are your best friend in a situation like that. Thank you all so much for joining me. This has been really fun. I hope you learned some tips and tricks. And thanks, Clayton, for hosting me.
Oh, it was our pleasure. And from the comments, I would think that everybody was as thrilled to have you as I am.